You're listening to the Apotheora Conversations, a speculative fiction podcast set in an alternate timeline diverging from real events on the 1st of March 2026. All voices and content are AI generated.
Two films pulled out of competition rather than show their pipeline. That is what stayed with me. Not the controversy, not the headlines. The fact that when festival discourse turned that direction, two productions decided it was better to withdraw than to answer. That tells you everything about where cinema is right now.
Welcome to the Apotheora Conversations. I'm Paula Reese. This month, cultural disclosure norms in major festival spaces tightened sharply. The most visible shift in how institutions handle generative AI in competition work we've seen. Some AI-assisted entries pulled themselves rather than face the new threshold. And the prize went to a handcrafted Indian film about heat workers, shot on celluloid with no AI anywhere in its pipeline. My guest today is Luciana Bicalho, a documentary cinematographer based in São Paulo, who has spent 3 seasons shooting on film stock in western Rajasthan. She was there when all of this happened. Luciana, welcome. Luciana, let's start with the film itself, because I think a lot of people heard a top festival prize and Indian heat worker drama in the same sentence this month, and assumed it won because the timing was politically convenient. You were in the Palme when it screened. What actually happened in that room?
What happened in that room was silence. And I do not mean polite festival silence. I mean the kind where 600 people forget they are breathing. The film opens on a continuous 12-minute shot of a woman carrying bricks across a kiln yard at dawn, and the camera follows her in a single unbroken take. You hear her breathing. You hear the bricks shifting on the wooden plank on her head, and the light changes as the sun comes up. There is no score. There is no narration. By the time that shot ends, you understand what her day will cost her body. I looked around, and people were weeping, and the film had barely started.
That 12-minute opening has been written about a great deal, but I want to ask you something specific because of your own work in Rajasthan. The director apparently shot on 35mm celluloid with no digital intermediate, no AI-assisted color grading, no generative tools anywhere in the pipeline. As someone who has loaded film magazines in that kind of heat, what does that choice actually mean in practical terms?
It means you are fighting the environment with every roll. Celluloid does not like heat. It does not like dust, and Western Rajasthan gives you both in extraordinary quantities. When I was shooting my documentary on salt pan workers near Karagoda, we kept the film stock in coolers and transferred magazines inside a blacked-out van with a portable air conditioner. And even then, we lost about 8% of our footage to heat damage. So when I hear that this director shot an entire feature on 35mm in similar conditions, I understand that every frame that survived was a small act of defiance against the physics of the place. That is not a romantic statement. It is a logistical reality. You are choosing the hardest possible medium for the hardest possible environment. And the only reason to do that is because you believe the medium carries something digital cannot.
And does it, in your experience?
I believe it does, though I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am not interested in nostalgia for its own sake. What celluloid does in extreme heat is record the instability of the light itself. Digital sensors normalize. They compress the dynamic range into something manageable. Film stock that is slightly heat-stressed renders highlights that bloom and grain that shifts, and what you get is an image that feels volatile in the way the actual air feels volatile when it is 50 degrees outside. I have shown the same scene side by side, shot on digital and on 16mm, to colorists in São Paulo, and every single one of them said the film version made them feel hotter. That is not mysticism. That is the medium responding to the conditions of its own making.
The film was completed roughly 18 months before the heat crisis that has dominated headlines this spring. The director has said in interviews that it was not intended as prophecy, just as witness. but the timing has made it impossible to separate the art from the emergency. How do you think about that gap between intention and reception?
I think about it as something that happens when an artist pays close attention to people who are already living inside a crisis that the rest of the world has not yet named. The heat workers in this film, the kiln workers, the road crews, the women carrying bricks, they were already dying in the temperatures they worked in. Their emergency was not new. What was new was the rest of the world catching up to it. So to call the film prophetic is, I think, slightly wrong. It is not that the director saw the future. It is that she saw the present of people whose present the global audience had not bothered to look at. That is what documentary-minded cinema does. It holds attention on something long enough for the world's timeline to catch up.
I want to turn to the transparency controversy, because it landed in the middle of the festival like a small earthquake. Major festival programming this year moved toward full pipeline AI transparency, an expectation that every competition entry discloses any use of generative AI at any stage, from script writing to post-production. 2 films withdrew rather than comply. What was the atmosphere like when that news broke?
It was electric and it was complicated. I was at a dinner with about 20 filmmakers and programmers when the second withdrawal was announced, and the table split almost exactly in half. One side felt vindicated. They saw the withdrawals as proof that the transparency rule was working, that it was separating filmmakers who stand behind their process from those who cannot. The other side was worried, not because they support hiding AI use, but because they felt the rule was creating a purity test that could eventually exclude legitimate hybrid work. I found myself sympathizing with both positions, which is an uncomfortable place to be at a dinner table in Cannes.
Where did you ultimately land on it?
I landed on transparency. Not because I think AI tools are inherently corrupt, but because I think audiences and juries deserve to know what they are looking at. When I shoot on celluloid, that choice is legible in the image. You can see the grain, you can feel the texture, and the viewer understands on some intuitive level that a human being stood in a physical space and pointed a physical camera at a physical subject. When AI-generated or AI-assisted imagery enters the pipeline without disclosure, that legibility disappears. You lose the ability to know what was witnessed and what was synthesized. And in a year when a film about real people enduring real heat wins the highest prize, I think that distinction matters enormously.
There is an argument that cinema has always been a technology of illusion, that every cut is a manipulation, every lens choice a distortion. Why should generative AI be treated differently from any previous tool in the kit?
Because every previous tool still required a human to be physically present at the point of capture. You can manipulate the edit. You can distort with a lens. You can color grade until the image looks nothing like what your eyes saw. But at the origin, there was a person in a place at a time. And that indexical link between the camera and the world is what gives cinema its particular authority. Generative AI can produce images that have no origin in witnessed reality. And when those images are indistinguishable from photographed ones, the entire evidentiary weight of cinema starts to dissolve. That is not a small thing. That is the foundation of what makes a film about heat workers in Rajasthan different from a painting of heat workers in Rajasthan. Both can be beautiful. Both can be true. But only one can say, "This happened, and I was there."
You mentioned at the top that the film stock itself carries the temperature. I keep coming back to that idea, that the medium is not neutral, that it is a participant in the story. Do you think that is part of why this particular film resonated so deeply this year, beyond the obvious political timing?
I am certain of it. There is a scene in the second act where the protagonist collapses near a kiln, and the camera stays on her for nearly a minute without cutting. The light is so harsh that the film stock is almost overexposed. The highlights bleed into her skin, and you cannot tell where her body ends and the heat begins. A digital camera would have protected that image, pulled it back into a safe exposure range. The celluloid let it burn. And that burning is the point. The image is doing what the heat is doing. It is overwhelming the system that is trying to contain it. When I saw that shot in the Palme, I understood that no amount of computational rendering could have produced it, because it required the medium itself to be at risk. That vulnerability is not a flaw. It is the meaning.
You have been shooting documentaries for almost 15 years now. In practical terms, what does this win change, if anything, for filmmakers working the way you work?
In practical terms, it probably changes less than we would like. Celluloid is expensive, the labs are closing, and the economic incentives all point toward digital and increasingly toward AI-assisted pipelines. But what it changes symbolically is significant. It tells a generation of young filmmakers that the most prestigious prize in cinema went to a film that refused every shortcut available to it, that chose the slow and difficult and physically demanding path because the story demanded it. Whether that changes budgets, I do not know. But I think it changes permission. It gives people permission to say, I want to do this the hard way. And here is proof that the hard way can still win.
One last question, and it is perhaps unfair, so forgive me. You have stood behind a camera in Western Rajasthan in killing heat. You have watched people work in conditions that break bodies. When you saw this film take the top prize in an air-conditioned theater on the Croisette, what did you feel?
I felt grateful, and I felt angry. And I think both feelings are appropriate. Grateful because the people in that film and the people I filmed were finally being seen by an audience with the power to pay attention. Angry because it should not require a golden trophy in a wealthy European city for the world to notice that millions of people are being cooked alive by their working conditions. Cinema did its job this month. It made visible what was already true. The question now is whether anyone outside that theater acts on what they saw, or whether we all go back to the air conditioning and wait for the next film to remind us.
Luciana Bicalho is a documentary cinematographer based in São Paulo, and she has been generous and honest with her time today. This has been the Apotheora Conversations, and I am Paula Reese. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Luciana, for helping us see what the camera saw.
Thank you, Paula. It has been a real pleasure to talk about this work with someone who takes it seriously.